Okay, so good morning. We're back to MiFID on Friday. The last slide we discussed was this one on clients classification and categorization. I will go back on this. In the next set of slides, I will describe better how the system of classification and reclassification of clients works. As of today, we have now to look at the definition of financial instruments. This is a fundamental definition for MiFID because, as you remember, financial services and activities come within the scope of the directive if they refer to financial instruments. So the two definitions are strictly linked. You might have an investment service. Remember this slide with the different sort of examples I made. You may have an activity, a service, which falls into this scheme, but if it does not concern financial instruments, it would fall outside the scope of MiFID. Now, the definition of financial instruments is included in the annex to the directive, and there is a section C, which contains a list of these financial instruments, and it is therefore a definition which is tendentially precise. It is not merely, conceptual. It is not simply based on a general notion of what is a financial instrument, but you have a list, and the list is made up of 11 items, and all of these slides sort of repeat what you find in the list: number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it's quite comprehensive, and if we were to really consider each of these items and discuss its implications, it would probably be too long, but also unnecessary, because once again, what I would like you to have is a more sort of structural, general overview of how this topic is handled by MiFID. So therefore, the first thing that you need to understand when you look at this list is that it is actually divided into two sections. And section 1 covers items 1, 2, 3, basically. It covers the first 3 items. And then you have the other 8 items coming up down the line. And this division, the first block, which is made up of 3 items, and the second block can be broadly described with a small exception in relation to item 11, which is in green, but I'll go back on that later on. You can briefly describe these two sections as section 1 being related to cash instruments, and the section 2, from number 4 onwards, derivative instruments. This is why in this slide you see the derivative world, because it is really quite a long list of derivative contracts that you find there. So let's start with the first part, cash instruments. This is probably the most straightforward thing you can think of when you imagine what financial instruments are, what investment services should be. And in fact, you find in this list, the basic financial products and instruments that you find on the market: equity, debt securities, and units of investment funds, number 3, money market instruments. Money market instruments, I'm sure you are perfectly confident with this notion, but it includes all kinds of securities that are issued on the market by, for example, credit institutions, banks, and also government bonds of any kind are included in the definition of money market instruments. The directive does not give us additional elements in order to identify what money market instruments are. So we need, to refer to the world of market practice, but I mean, these are pretty intuitive and straightforward concepts. The list of these cash instruments opens up with a clear reference to the basic tools that corporations use in order to raise capital from the market. On the one side, you have equity instruments such as shares, letter A. On the other side, you have debt instruments such as bonds. And you have to consider that the notion of a share or a bond is actually to be identified on the basis of national company legislation. Across the European Union, we do not have a uniform or unique regulation of corporations. Each country has its own national regime, its own national company legislation. Sometimes this legislation is made up of one single piece of law, sometimes it is spread out through different legal sources, but this doesn't really make much difference. It is national law that will tell you whether the security you're looking at is a share or a bond. And there are big differences among 27 member states, different approaches and different ways through which shares or bonds are identified. And therefore, MiFID keeps a flexible approach. It is not entirely rigid in providing these definitions. For instance, look at letter A. Letter A refers to shares, and but also includes other securities equivalent to shares in companies. And also letter B is similar. It refers to bonds, so we are supposed to know what a bond is, but also includes other forms of securitized debts. And this allows for flexibility, and it's very important because otherwise MiFID would not be able to capture instruments which are not formally classified as shares, but have traits which are similar and very close to shares. In Italy, for example, but this is also valid for many other jurisdictions, companies can issue shares, bonds, and also other kinds of instruments which are not technically regulated as shares. So, for instance, they are not part of the company's capital as shares should be, but they share with shares many features. For example, they provide some kind of voting rights in the company's decision. They grant a right to perceive dividends if the company distributes profits. But on the other side, they can be structured as these instruments, which are not formally shares. There's a lot of flexibility in company law, and you can structure these instruments so as to make them closer to a bond. And the typical nature of a bond is that, first of all, the money which the investor has paid into the instrument is actually a loan, so it is subject to restitution, which is a typical feature of debt securities in juxtaposition with shares, which instead are equity, and they do not have any right to restitution to the investor. So the typical features of a bond are that capital is actually lent to the company and needs to be restituted upon expiry of the instrument. And also bonds have an interest rate. They bear an interest rate that pays out interests according to various mechanisms. Okay, so these are the two basic elements. So in national law, you may find securities which are not directly labeled or regulated as bonds, but they share some elements of similarity with bonds. And this makes the MiFID approach flexible enough and capable of adapting to national legislation, which can be comprehensive and quite diversified throughout the European Union. Also, the MiFID covers securities that give the right to acquire or sell transferable securities or give rise to a cash settlement determined by reference to these transferable securities. Now, this letter C is a little bit disturbing here, because actually what MiFID is describing in this letter C is the derivative contract. So one may wonder why this letter C didn't fall into the second part of the list straight away, but it was kept here. And there is really no answer to this question. It's a little bit of an incoherence in the list of financial instruments. And but actually, what letter C is talking about is something that is more appropriately to be described as a financial derivative, and so it should have been in the second part of the list. Regardless of this aspect, there is a very important element that needs to be satisfied when looking at shares and bonds financial instruments. And this element is in bold in the very first line of the definition. And it refers to negotiability, to the negotiability of the instrument on the capital market. Now, this is a fundamental element in order to consider whether these instruments are effectively financial instruments. I just want to point out that negotiability is not expressly set out as a requisite for money market instruments and units in investment funds. You see, it is only set out explicitly for shares, bonds, and these sort of quasi-derivative contracts under letter C. But my opinion is that negotiability is indeed a general requirement of all financial instruments, and that it is considered as embedded in money market instruments and units in collective investment undertakings, because in fact money market instruments are naturally negotiable. Money market is one of the most liquid and probably efficient markets worldwide. So instruments that are placed on the market must be negotiable, because otherwise they're simply not suited for that kind of market. And units in investment funds, we will see, and you will realize once we talk about UCITS and alternative investment funds, that their structure is really sort of embedded. It has embedded in its DNA the concept of negotiability of units of investment funds. So ultimately, the element of negotiability doesn't really need to be set out explicitly for the other kinds of financial instruments we are considering, but because it is really embedded in these financial instruments. Differently from these, shares and bonds instead can be more or less negotiable on the market. And unfortunately, we do not have a definition of what negotiable means in the context of MiFID. We have no definition in the articles of the directive. We have no clarification in the whereas of the directive as to what negotiable means. So this is left open to interpretation, and it is unfortunately a part which I think is truly missing in the context of this huge normative package which we know is MiFID II. I would have preferred to have some kind of indication, maybe in the whereas, if not truly a definition of what negotiable is. But we have nothing of the sort. We only have the general notion set on the table. Now, over time, we see how difficult things can get because of this reference of negotiability. Because on the one side, it is essential, it is an essential requisite. If a security is not negotiable, it would not be subject to MiFID. The reason for this, the reason why this notion is so important, is that MiFID is truly a normative package that regulates the transactions on the market. If you think about it, you have the two areas of MiFID. Area 1 is investment services and activities, and we saw that investment services imply the carrying out of an activity that results in the circulation of financial products on the market, whether it is portfolio management, whether it is executing orders on behalf of the clients. There is this element of circulation of securities which is clearly embedded in the first part of the directive. The second part of the directive is about trading venues, and well, trading venues are there in order to facilitate the circulation and the exchange of securities on the market. So you see that MiFID is truly a directive which is not simply on financial markets and financial instruments, but it is on those transactions on financial markets imply the transfer of securities. And this is why negotiability is so important and in line. But on the other side, when we look at new phenomena, such as, for example, crypto assets, tokens, security tokens, Bitcoin, and so on, the fact that we don't have any indication as to what negotiability means creates problems. In January 2019, ESMA provided an opinion to the Commission for the possible regulation of crypto assets. And we will go back to this topic because we have a specific class on crypto assets and EU capital markets law. But in this 2019 opinion, ESMA was considering topics such as what is Bitcoin, what is a token in an initial coin offering, what are utility tokens, and they tried to provide some kind of support to the Commission by helping the taxonomy of these different assets that we now have on the market and that are gaining increasing importance, as you well know. Well, this opinion was very important because the Commission used it extensively in order to elaborate on what we call MiCAR, and MiCAR is an acronym that stands for Markets in Crypto Assets Regulations. Okay, so you can also call it MiCAR regulation, and if you are a fan of the famous pop singer, you would certainly prefer the second approach because it sort of identifies MiCA, and many people call this regulation MiCA actually. I don't know whether they do that because they are fans of the pop singer or not, but you should call it MiCAR in the end. And this is a brand new proposal by the Commission. The Commission in September 2020 came out with the proposal for a new regulation on crypto assets, building extensively on ESMA opinion of 2019. Now we will go back on this MiCAR proposal, but why am I citing this opinion and the MiCAR proposal? Because in providing this opinion, ESMA at a certain point had to address some fundamental questions, such as, are crypto assets similar to financial instruments? Because if they are, they might fall under MiFID. And we might not need a new regulation on crypto assets at all. And naturally, in order to answer this question, you would have to look at your crypto asset and see whether it is similar to a share, because it provides to the investor some rights which are close enough to those of shares. Participation in equity, in some kind of form of equity capital, dividends, voting rights. This would be similar to a share. And ESMA also ended up by considering the element of negotiability. And they tried to sort of provide further guidance as to what negotiability means. And they interviewed all the supervisors of the member states in the context of this opinion on various topics, including negotiability. And you clearly see from that opinion how different views were amongst different national authorities in relation to the element of negotiability. For some authorities, for instance, negotiability means that the securities must be effectively traded on the market, not necessarily a trading venue such as a regulated market, but they must be in some way actively traded on the market, including over the counter. For other authorities, this was not relevant at all. They said we simply have to look whether the instrument might be traded on some kind of market, not whether it is actually traded. And the different views also in terms of other aspects. For instance, some think that if the instrument is subject to some kind of limitation that sort of render the transfer possible, but subject to certain conditions. You can think, for example, as one of these limitations might be that the company's bylaws say that the shares can only be transferred to certain kind of investors. This is a limitation as to the free transferability of the shares, because you would be able to transfer if you're a shareholder, but only to a certain category of people. Or another typical limitation that applies to the transfer of shares might be preemptive rights. Under a preemptive right, if a shareholder wants to transfer his shares, he needs to offer the shares first to other shareholders, who therefore have a right of first refusal. If they don't, if the other shareholders do not buy the shares, then the shares can be sold freely on the market. So according to certain authorities or interpretations, if you have these kind of limitations, shares are not negotiable on the market. But on the other side, other people think that these limitations are not sufficient to exclude negotiability, that negotiability is instead excluded when you have a straightforward prohibition to transfer. And sometimes you find that under national law, national and local corporate and company legislation allows not just for these limitations to be inserted in the bylaws of the company, but also allows for a prohibition to transfer shares. This is, for instance, what you find also in Italian law. Italian company law allows companies to prohibit the transfer of the shares by shareholders for a period of maximum 5 years. So you would have 5 years. If the company follows this approach, you have 5 years during which shares cannot be transferred at all. And this is a prohibition. So some people think that only if you have a prohibition, shares would not be negotiable. Others think that also limitations have produced the result of making the shares not negotiable on the capital market. Now, in considering crypto assets, this is a very crucial topic, because crypto assets might fall within the scope of MiFID if they are similar to shares, but also if they are negotiable. And some of these crypto assets are not negotiable at all. Others are negotiable but with limitations, and you clearly see how crucial this point is now becoming in the context of the new technological developments that we see on the market. And it's truly a shortfall of MiFID not having provided any clarification in this respect, we might have to wait a decision by the Court of Justice that could provide, the official interpretation of European law in this respect. But as far as I am aware, there are no open, outstanding cases in front of the Court of Justice that would in some way consider this aspect. But it is very important. So do not ever forget always to clarify that a share or a bond is a MiFID instrument as long as, not per se, but as long as it is negotiable on the market. Okay, always remember that negotiability is an essential requisite of these securities. Now, these transferable securities, thank you, Orazio. No, MiCA is still being discussed. It was presented in September 2020 by the Commission, actually in a big package together with two other regulations. One is on DLT, distributed ledger technology market infrastructures, and one is called, so you have MiCAR, you have the DLT regulation, and you have a third proposal which is called DORA, which is on operational resilience. And these three regulations are part of a major finance digital package, and they're now being discussed. If you are interested, on Thursday, I know you're very busy, so I don't want to bother you with additional work, and in any case, it's got nothing to do with the exam. But on Thursday morning at 8:45, I will be providing a guest lecture at the EUDIFIN Jean Monnet Center, together with in cooperation with Università Ca' Foscari of Venice, on MiCAR, on the draft MiCAR and its implications. So it's Università Ca' Foscari. I'm sorry, I cannot give you, if you're interested in attending this presentation, I cannot send you the link because I haven't received it yet. But I am sure that if you go on the website of Università Ca' Foscari, you will see the link, and in any case, it has already been widely publicized on LinkedIn and all that sort of stuff. I assume that you will be able to simply attend through some kind of platform, whether it is Cisco or Zoom. Okay, so it's Thursday morning, 8:45, discussing MiCA. But don't worry, if you're interested and you have no time to follow or don't simply want to follow the presentation on Thursday, we have a lesson on crypto assets where I will pick up most of the things that I will be probably more briefly and with a more sort of student-oriented approach, but I will pick up most of these concepts in the lesson that we have on crypto assets. Okay, so these first instruments that we're looking at, they are called, MiFID calls them transferable securities. You have a sort of a subcategory within the list of financial instruments. These first are called transferable securities, and this definition, this sub-definition of transferable securities is quite important because it is linked to the Prospectus Regulation. So the Prospectus Regulation, which we should have considered during the course, but then, as I told you last week, I cancelled that lesson so as to have some time to talk about banking resolution. But the Prospectus Regulation is linked to transferable securities. And Prospectus, as I told you several times, is a regulation that says if you offer securities, if somebody offers securities to the public in Europe, this offer must be accompanied by a prospectus that contains all the relevant information so that investors carry out a reasonably informed decision. I told you right at the beginning of the course that the Prospectus Regulation, even though it is quite a boring piece of legislation, at least I'm not truly a fan of the Prospectus Regulation, I must say, but it is very important, and it stands really sort of in the background. It's a backbone of all capital markets legislation in the European Union, and it's also one of the most ancient forms of capital markets regulation in the European Union, because the first directive on prospectus dates back to the early 1980s. So it's really something that we have truly embedded in our DNA. So the prospectus regulation applies to transferable securities. And what you can gather if you look at this connection between prospectus and MiFID is that transferable securities really represent the core of the core topic of European capital markets legislation, because those securities are subject to MiFID, to prospectus, and since they are subject to MiFID, they're also subject to the market abuse regulation that we will extensively discuss. So these are really, the core of the topics on capital markets legislation in Europe. And this is why they're so important, transferable securities, to identify. Once upon a time, the first directive on prospectus, the second directive on prospectus, used to follow a different approach, provided its own definition of financial instruments. And this created a lot of problems because there were misalignment between prospectus and MiFID and market abuse. And luckily enough, in the last versions of the directive and now of the prospectus regulation, the two worlds, MiFID and prospectus, are perfectly aligned. But beware, the prospectus only applies to transferable securities. The prospectus regulation shall not apply to money market instruments or to units in collective investment undertakings, let alone to the derivative world of contracts falling into the list of MiFID from item 4 until the end. Okay, so it is a common core, but it's quite limited because the common core of European capital markets is on transferable securities, but these only include the first items that you see in the MiFID list. And all the rest is a little bit dispersed. Derivatives are subject to MiFID, but they're not subject to prospectus regulation. Since they are subject to MiFID, they are also subject to market abuse. So it's a little bit sort of a patchwork, but transferable securities are really, the core of capital markets regulation and legislation in Europe. Once you are done with the first part of the list, which is about cash instruments, transferable securities, money market instruments, and units in investment funds, you have to face the complex derivative world. And it is quite complex because it is made up of a long list of definitions. You see, from number 4 to number 10. Now, I don't want you to get sort of too much involved into these definitions. They are there for you basically to look at, but I will never expect you to learn these by heart. I would rather expect you to understand how this long list is structured. And it is structured quite clearly into two different parts. The first one is basically item 4, probably also item 5, but item 4 is really straightforward. And the first part, item 4, is about truly financial derivatives. And the rest is commodity derivatives. There's a clear distinction between these two different elements. Now, financial derivatives are derivatives that, as you see in number 4, relate to typically financial underlying assets, such as currencies, securities, interest rates, or other derivative instruments. And these are financial derivatives that fall within the scope of MiFID because of everything that we have been saying. Commodity derivatives, instead, are derivatives that may have as an underlying element virtually quite a lot of stuff you can think of. Naturally, commodities, the directive and the level 2 provisions give us a definition of what is a commodity for the purpose of MiFID. It is quite a cumbersome concept, but basically it would include any any good that you would think of, such as raw materials, but also immaterial goods such as electricity, such as gas, and so on. Okay, so the world of commodity derivatives intended in a very large way. But then the interesting part is that if you go through all the list and you reach item 10, you realize that these non-financial derivatives may actually refer to anything that can be used as an underlying for a derivative. So take a look at letter 10 and see how comprehensive this is. This is in addition to what comes before. So what comes before deals with, let's say, traditional commodity derivatives, such as raw materials, again, electricity, gas, etc. But number 10 clearly shows that derivatives may come within the scope of MiFID, even if they relate to quite different assets. You find in here references to climatic variables, freight rates, inflation rates, other official economic statistics, and then you have a sort of a closing remark which captures anything else you might think of, as well as any other derivative, contracts relating to assets, rights, obligations, indices, and measures not otherwise mentioned in this section. So any derivative may fall within the scope of MiFID. Any derivative, including derivatives on which are quite widespread on the market, you know, those derivatives that are, for instance, linked to catastrophic events, such as earthquakes, tsunami, and hurricanes, but also derivatives linked to entirely immaterial elements or exotic indexes. Okay. Now, this is quite tricky because you, on the one side, you may think that this is appropriate. It's a good approach because MiFID is about investor protection. Derivatives are very complex and most of the times very risky instruments. And so it does make sense that MiFID follows this huge approach in sort of covering the entire universe of derivatives, not just financial derivatives, but any kind of derivative. Also, you might see and realize that if you look at the definitions, these definitions refer to, in the first part, standard derivative contracts, standard, or rather, you know, common market practice derivatives, such as options, futures, swaps, forwards. These are all concepts that you are very familiar with. But at the same time, just as we saw with transferable securities, in transferable securities, MiFID says a share is a transferable security, but also any other instrument which is similar to a share. And this provides flexibility. But also in derivatives, you find this approach. See? Pick up whatever item you want, maybe 6, options, futures, swaps, and any other derivative contract. So this definition is not linked to a specific contractual form. MiFID looks at the substance, and if the substance is a derivative contract, whether it is formally a future, a swap, or an option, wouldn't really make any difference. So you might think that this approach is good because derivatives are risky, they are complex, MiFID is about investor protection, and it's a good approach. Okay, but it has its drawbacks. It's an approach which has its drawbacks because the more you widen the scope of MiFID in the world of derivatives, and the more you end up by submitting entire areas of the economy to capital markets legislation. Think about, for instance, energy producers, gas producers, traders in oil, in commodities. Sometimes you don't realize, but there are certain areas of the industry which use a lot of derivatives for the purpose of fixing the price of a certain commodity a certain period of time. When I don't know whether you've heard about it, probably you have, but you know the biggest bankruptcy in the history of the United States was the Enron bankruptcy, something which happened more than 20 years ago by now, but which is still clearly in the memory of everybody who looks at economic company bankruptcy legislation, and it was the biggest bankruptcy in the US history. Now Enron turned out to be quite a complex story because Enron had a lot of outstanding commercial derivatives on the market in areas which you would never think of, including, for example, paper, the paper industry that backs up, you know, all the editorship, including newspapers and so on, is an industry that uses a lot of derivatives. It uses quite an extensive amount of derivatives in order to fix the price of paper on the secondary market at a certain date. So if you expand MiFID, what you end up by doing is that you sort of submit entire areas of industry activities to capital markets legislation. And this is something on which not everybody agrees, obviously, because on the one side, financial supervisors and also big investment banks across the world would like to see this approach in place. Especially investment banks, if you widen the scope of MiFID, they enlarge their market, and that's business coming in. Because if you say that a certain derivative is a MiFID derivative, then you would have to be licensed under MiFID in order to exchange that derivative on the market. And what you end up by doing is that you're bringing business to the big world of multinational investment banks. And on the other side, industry players are not happy with that. They say, why should we be subject to capital markets legislation if we exchange commodities through derivatives for industrial purposes, for commercial purposes or industrial purposes? And at that point, you will have the typical political discussion that sort of the result of which would be more in one sense or more in the other. So this is a topic that came up originally already in the context of the ISD of 1993. Then it was rediscussed in MiFID I, and now it has been rediscussed with what you find in MiFID II, but it's not necessarily be there forever, because we are now in the process of reviewing MiFID II. In a couple of years, we will have MiFID III in place, and we already see that there are strong movements in the area of derivative contracts in order to shift MiFID on the one side or the other, or the other side. But what we have now is basically a big distinction in MiFID between financial and non-financial derivatives. That the first, financial derivatives, is item 4. Non-financial derivatives are captured by MiFID if and only if they have some kind of financial element in them. So commodity derivatives per se are not within the scope of MiFID unless they have an element of some kind of financial nature. And for MiFID, the elements are 2, either of them. The first one, you can clearly see it in number 5. A commodity derivative, you see that this is about commodities, okay, is a financial derivative for MiFID if it is settled in cash. Okay, because if the derivative is settled in cash, you can say that the scope of that derivative is not to have access to the underlying commodity, but rather to make a financial investment. So that's the first element. A commodity derivative settled in cash for MiFID purposes is a MiFID derivative. It is a financial instrument, and it would be captured by the derivative. The second element, and this has changed over time, but just look at this, in MiFID II, is that a commodity derivative is a financial derivative for MiFID, becomes a financial instrument, therefore, if it is traded on a trading venue. Okay? Yeah, great, Pavel's. This is a absolutely good catch. This list is a little bit confused because actually number 4 and number 1C overlap. And I think that the Commission, in drafting the MiFID II, because in MiFID I, letter C of item 1 was not there, we didn't have letter C, but in redrafting the list and inserting item C, they sort of mixed up things, because letter C should really fall under number 4 of the list, as you are rightly saying. And very good question, and congratulations for having captured this, because it's not so straightforward. It doesn't make much sense. And in fact, if you look at national law implementing MiFID, in national law, for example, Italian law, French law, German law, you see that national legislator has clarified that letter C is a derivative contract. But it's just that they mixed things up, and they should have really included letter C in number 4 of the list. Okay, so the elements of kind of financial nature that would bring you to consider that a non-financial derivative is instead subject to MiFID are 2. Number 1, cash settlement. Okay, this is absolutely fundamental. All cash settled derivatives are MiFID derivatives. 2, derivatives which are traded on trading venues, so on regulated markets, MTFs and OTFs. The simple fact that a commodity derivative is exchanged on a trading venue regulated by MiFID makes it a financial derivative, even if it is settled in kind. Please bear this in mind, even if under number 2 it is settled in kind. Settlement at that point is irrelevant, because if the derivative is exchanged on a regulated market or MTF or whatever, it is traded, and therefore falls into the concept of MiFID having to do with things that are regularly exchanged on secondary markets. Now, this approach was the result, well, there were tremendous fights at a political level in MiFID I that followed more or less this approach with minor differences that you can simply forget. And then, you know, people started discussing again in MiFID II. Now we are discussing in MiFID III, and there are a lot of exceptions to this rule in MiFID II that were inserted for the benefit of the industry, because the industry complained ultimately that this approach was too large, that it was only for the benefit of big investment banks having huge businesses coming in. But it was really very, very, very controversial. So, for instance, you already see an exception in number 6 of the definition. You see? And in here, we say that everything is fine, but for wholesale energy products traded on an OTF that must be physically settled. Okay, Now, don't ask me the rationale, truly, of this exception. Don't ask me why is it wholesale energy products and not wholesale gas products. Don't ask me why the exception only applies to OTFs and not MTFs, because eventually I can provide you an answer which would require maybe 15 minutes. It doesn't make, but ultimately, what we're talking about here is the result of political negotiations. Okay. And then you find other exemptions in MiFID that address this topic. For instance, there is an exemption if derivatives, commodity derivatives, which should be considered as financial, there is an exception if these derivatives are traded by the industry on an ancillary basis, because they are ancillary to their main business, which is industrial. And naturally, what is ancillary? How do you define whether something is ancillary or not? You have criteria, you have technical standards under MiFID that sort of draw the line and sort of allow you to identify when something is ancillary and something is not. One of the main criteria is obviously the volumes of these derivatives vis-a-vis the size of the global business of the entity you are considering. But see, this is a very critical area, and I mean, it is not always a good choice to say that everything should fall into financial markets legislation, because this might not be truly in the interest of the global community and of market players that have nothing to do with finance in a strict sense. There are transaction costs embedded in applying MiFID in a very wide way that are not always reasonable to apply. Okay, so once you have finished the list of financial instruments, what you end up is with a new item, entirely new, that has been added in the list by MiFID II. And this item is, I think, truly fascinating conceptually, but also in terms of functioning of the MiFID package. And it refers to emission allowances. Emission allowances are financial instruments, have become financial instruments after MiFID II. Now, you may be familiar with emission allowances, but just in case you are not, emission allowances come out of the Kyoto Protocol, which is the most important international agreement for the reduction of CO2 emissions in the world. And this Kyoto Protocol has then been sort of translated into Europe through specific legislative provisions, including a directive which is quite old by now. It has a directive, as you see, of 2003 that sets up a European scheme for exchanging these emission allowances. Now, emission allowances are basically represent the right to issue CO2 emissions in the atmosphere by a single state and by single enterprises and producers within the state. So an emission allowance represents what is the maximum limit of CO2 that you can distribute in the atmosphere. And you know that under the Kyoto Protocol, there is a maximum cap worldwide of emission allowances. The cap is being reduced over time because we're trying desperately to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and over time there are targets that should be met by all the Kyoto Protocol participants. And these global targets are then applied state by state, and within the state, it's very granular. Every single producer that is involved with emitting CO2, with the emission of CO2 in the atmosphere, must comply with its individual targets. Ultimately, what you end up with is that you will have some producers which are desperately in need of more allowances because they carry on a business which is quite polluting, and or they are not so efficient in reducing their own emission allowances, and they would need more capacity. And then you have other producers instead which are virtuous, or they're simply producing less, and they have an excess capacity of emission allowances. Sorry, am I repeating things which are absolutely obvious and just losing time? If I am, just raise your hand and say, Professor, skip all of this because we are very familiar with all of this scheme. So you may have in a certain country, in a certain town, in a certain region, you may have people who want to pollute more and people who are polluting less. Now, at that point, the directive of 2003 envisaged a trading scheme that would allow for the transfer of these emission allowances. So people who have excess capacity and are not using it would be able to sell to those who need it their excess capacity. They would be able to transform into cash their right to send out in the atmosphere CO2. And this has been done in order, now there is an economic paradigm that says that if you build up these systems for the exchange of emission allowances, this would create a secondary market for these allowances and would facilitate the achievement of the objectives of the Kyoto Protocol. There is extensive literature on this, and if you're interested, on my SSRN page, there is a paper that provides you with additional information on these economic theories, albeit, I must say, they are quite challenged. Not everybody agrees on the fact that there is such a direct link by building up a structured system for exchanging emission allowances and the reduction of CO2 emissions. Over time, after the Directive 2003 came into force, the secondary markets for these emission allowances became more and more sophisticated. First of all, we had a huge development in derivatives on emission allowances. Now, derivatives on emission allowances would certainly fall under MiFID because they would fall under Item 10. Item 10 is sufficiently wide to include derivatives on emission allowances. I think you agree with that. But we know that this is true if the derivative is traded on an OTF, on a regulated market, on an MTF, or whether it is settled in cash. And in MiFID II, when the Commission started working on MiFID II, at that point, some very bad things happened on the markets of emission allowances. Not the derivative part so much, but the cash part, which was not covered by MiFID at the time. And there were serious cases of market manipulation, lack of transparency. And at that point, the Commission said we have to do something about this because these markets are becoming very important and also with considerable volumes. And at that point, they set out the proposal to include emission allowances directly into the scope of MiFID. And at that point, they were included. And since they are included in MiFID, they are also included in the market abuse regulation that we will discuss. So they are entirely covered by both provisions. Now, this is interesting, and it sort of, on the one side, I read on the newspapers last week that these markets which are trading platforms, today they have to be recognized and regulated under MiFID because they are trading platforms on financial instruments as a consequence of the enlargement of MiFID. And I saw that the volume of these trading platforms has grown tremendously. And also since January, the price of emission allowances seems to have increased of more than 40%. This is what the newspaper was talking about. It's a huge leap. And there's a lot of speculation on these markets, by the way, and there is a lot of concern that this ultimately turns out to be some kind of bubble on the market. And in fact, these platforms are being used today as truly financial platforms. Many people, investors, including institutional investors, investment funds, and even people who are in the industry, buy and trade these emission allowances, not truly as a way of exchanging the underlying capacity of CO2 emissions, but as a form of speculation and investment. I spoke with a couple of huge energy producers before I wrote my article. I conducted a couple of interviews, and they confirmed that the industry is looking at these markets in terms of a truly financial market, and not so much as a way to exchange the underlying capacity of emission allowances. So the question is, it's really fascinating. You have two aspects now to consider. The first is, if you think about it, we are saying that CO2, ultimately the atmosphere, thin air, is a financial instrument. And this is groundbreaking, because I mean, I could think of a lot of things to be treated as financial products, but really, you know, the atmosphere, no. But that's where we are. And this conceptually is fascinating. The second element that you might consider and reason upon is that what we are doing is that we are bringing in the scope of capital markets legislation emission allowances, because we believe that by having more efficient and transparent markets on emission allowances, we might effectively achieve better the result of protecting the planet. Because all of this stuff has an ultimate goal, which is not of setting up another trading venue on another financial product, but is to create an efficient, transparent market of emission allowances, because we think that that will help us achieving the reduction of CO2s in the atmosphere. But as of today, and as I explained in my paper, we really have no evidence whether this will work or not. We really have no evidence. The previous systems for the exchange of emission allowances, which were not as sophisticated as the ones we have today, MTFs, regulated markets, haven't really provided, or rather they haven't been studied with this perspective. So we do not have sufficient statistical data that really confirm that there is a direct correlation between building up these markets infrastructures and the reduction of CO2 emissions. And more widely speaking, what we are seeing, and you are truly familiar, I'm sure, with this, is that we now have a global trend of financial regulation on sustainability and finance, and that falls under the acronym ESG, environmental, social, and governance, corporate governance, finance. And I'm sure you are aware of this. And there's a huge body of European legislation coming in this area of ESG finance, including the taxonomy regulation, the regulation on the transparency of environmental factors in financial products, that goes in that direction. And the direction is, we think that the regulation of finance can truly support and help the protection of the environment. Okay, and this is a striking example in MiFID. Number 11 is really, wow, something that you would never have thought of. But now we have all the rest coming in, and this focus on finance as a way to support the protection of the environment is quite recent and truly groundbreaking, if you think about it. Okay, but only time will tell us if this is right or wrong. Only we need robust I always fight with my colleagues who are so excited by the idea of environmental finance, sustainability, and I look at them and I say, well, before we get so excited, we may need some strong, robust statistical evidence that tells us that this is not just, we have an expression now that is being used, greenwashing, just to go on the market and say, wow, we have sustainable products and we help the environment. But where is the evidence of this? Is it pure marketing? Because now protection of the environment is a fashionable topic. It's not fashionable, it's a very serious topic, because the future of the next generations depends on what we will be doing now. But are we sure that finance is truly capable of helping achieving what we're trying to achieve? Sometimes you get the impression that there's a lot of greenwashing and not just trying to repackage financial products so as to make them user-friendly for a consumer that thinks that if he doesn't use plastic when he drinks water, he helps the environment and saves the planet. That's basically, sometimes you get that silly impression. But we will see what happens next, and what we're really looking forward is to have some statistical evidence, at least on emission allowances in the European Union, and see what the impact of MiFID II has been on this very delicate and complex area. But I think it's a fascinating topic. So ultimately, in the end, what you see is that the definition of financial instruments has three big pieces inside: transferable securities, money market instruments, and investment funds also, and derivatives. And there is a sort of a bottom line, which is clearly set out by MiFID. And the bottom line is that instruments of payment are not financial instruments. So a banknote, a check, e-money is not a financial instrument at all. And this is a clear-cut borderline between MiFID world, and the rest instruments of payment. Now, instruments of payment are captured by European legislation. Obviously, we have two directives on payment systems, we have an e-money directive, and now we also have, once again, MiCAR coming in, because there is a whole set of provision in MiCAR that would apply to crypto instruments of payment, such as stable coins and, naturally, Libra kind instruments of payment. You may have followed all the discussion a couple of years ago on the Libra initiative by Facebook, which ultimately failed, but they're going to pick it up again, I'm pretty sure. And Libra would have been a digital instrument of payment, but not, allegedly, there were a lot of discussions on this, are financial instruments. And also, ultimately, central bank digital currencies. These are captured by MiCAR in some way because they're instruments of payment, but they're not financial instruments under MiFID. Okay, the last two slides refer to the definition of regulated markets, multilateral trading facilities, and organized trading facility, but we will not cover these today. We will stop here, and now I will show you a short video that sort of sums up the legislative structure of MiFID II, Lamfalussy, regulatory technical standards, just to make you relax for 10 minutes, because we will pick up these definitions of MTFs, regulated markets, when we talk about trading venues. I think it's the end of, not the next week, we don't have class, but the end of the week after the suspension of the classes of next week. Okay, so take a look. Now, please upload this video. It's an interview, a little bit commercial, but okay, you don't have to always be very static and academic. And it was taken in 2017. And that was the period when the legislative package was more or less in force, but there were still bits and pieces missing. Regulatory standards were not truly all on the table. The Commission was lagging behind, and that was the reason why the entry into force of MiFID II was postponed from 2017 to 2018, because the legal system was not ready, and member states told the Commission, you have to postpone MiFID. We cannot have this thing in January 2017, and that's why MiFID was postponed in 2018. Okay, so you will find concepts that you are familiar with, the structure of LAMFLOC, level 2, level 3, and at a certain point, they will show you how technical the discussion can get when it comes to regulatory and implementing technical standards. And you really have to look at the single comma, the single word, and political discussion might kick off at that point. But there is also another important message that comes out from the presentation, i.e. that most of the times when it comes to regulatory technical standards, this discussion does not really take place, because there is a tendency by the Commission to sort of accept the proposals coming up from ESMA. And in fact, the situations where you see the Commission challenging the proposal of ESMA and asking for amendments of a substantial nature are quite few. And this is interesting because it has an impact on the Meroni doctrine. Remember the Meroni doctrine? And because ultimately we say that legislative decisions must be left in the hands of the Council and the Commission. And ESMA is an agency, and it cannot really have discretionality, only technical. But if you have a very strong adherence by the Commission to the proposals of ESMA, the two things get sort of squeezed one on top of the other. And this has an impact on the concrete functioning of the Meroni doctrine over time. So take a look at the video. I will start it now and just say hello more or less towards the end. Okay, so we can stop here. This is clearly an example of how technical it can get. If you think that you have a normative package, more than 2,000 pages, huge technical standards, you start discussing these apparently minor topics that may have, however, a significant impact on the market, on the costs of transactions. You may understand how complex it is. And luckily enough, the LAMFLOC system has delegated these very technical part to the Commission and to ESMA, because it would be unimaginable to have these things discussed in Parliament or in the Council. But I think it's a good example that makes you see how LAMFLOC in practice works, and MiFID II is one of the biggest examples of overwhelming LAMFLOC architecture that we've been putting into place. But the interview was taken in March 2017, and the directive should have been already in force by January. So it was evident that too much complexities at that point sort of forced the Commission to accept the postponement of MiFID to 2018. Huh? Okay, guys, I think it's all for today. We had a lot of stuff coming in. I hope you found the discussion on emission allowances interesting, and see you on Friday with the next lesson on MiFID. We will be looking at slides 10 that you already find in on Blackboard. Okay, so I wish you a good day and see you on Friday.